Please be seated. Technology. We have wonderful groups that do various parts of things for the service and for the services, and they're very diligent, but there's always human error, and sometimes there's technical error. So we just live with it and go with it. Quite a few years ago, I had the opportunity to go to a conference. A couple of things appealing about it. One is that this was a new group with whom I had not had any time and any training, and I was very excited about this. But the other good thing about it was relatively close. I could be there, I could drive, and I could get there in 4 to 5 hours. That was enhanced by the fact that I, within a couple of miles, could jump on the interstate, drive all the way on the interstate to within a couple of miles of the conference, get off the interstate, and I'm right there. It was so easy, and it was so much fun to do that. So I went and was there for a week. And during that time, some things happened for me, and I shifted and changed, and I decided I didn't want to do the fast way home. So I drove a few miles on the interstate, and I got off onto what at one time was a main road, a well-traveled main venue, and began to drive along. Now, I chose this route not just because it would slow me down and I could meander through various places, but that some of those places through which I was going to meander were places where I had lived as a child. So some nostalgia had been triggered for me, and I thought, I will go and see some of these places. So I drove for a while, and lo and behold, I was driving by the house where we lived when I was in the 3rd grade, and it wasn't there. There was another house there, a much nicer house. They had replaced it. It was actually a parsonage for the church. And they had built a new parsonage there, and it looked very nice. And I thought that was really good. That was good because when we lived there, the old house had a tin roof, and every time it stormed, and it stormed a lot, something would get knocked out by lightning. So I thought, they've really upgraded that. That's a very nice thing to do. So I drove along. I drove around rivers, through woods, all of these things getting triggered. But ultimately, I wanted to go to this small town where we had lived from the time I was 9 months old until I finished the 1st grade. Our longest tenure anywhere. So as I started getting close, I knew from the major thoroughfare that this is it. We're getting there. Not a lot of changes. Small towns in Middle Tennessee don't change very much. Here's a new place for that, but it's still very recognizable. And I saw the house of the woman who was my caregiver before I went to school, and it's all very nostalgic. And so I get to the intersection where I know I'm to turn right. Now, as I get there, I'm aware that in my mind, this is a fairly long street that has a 90-degree turn in it, and then our house where we lived was going to be 3 or 4 houses down on the left. So I turn, and it's almost immediately there's a 90-degree curve. And I thought, that's not how it is. That's a much longer street, but it looks like it's the old street, and lo and behold, there's the same house that was sat in that curve. And so I made the curve, and I looked, and for the life of me, I could not find our house. Now, it was all the same houses that had been there all along. They had not raised them and built new houses. These were the same homes. But I have to tell you, they had shrunk. They had shrunk a lot. When I grew up, this street was a long street. And when I grew up, this house was a huge house. But it wasn't anymore. Has that ever happened to you? Those moments when those things that were grand and great to us as children, we began to see them again and we go, well, wait a minute. I'm not sure that that's the right place. Or if we recognize it, we look at it and we go, no, it was so much bigger then than it is now. Jesus has been to the temple and he walks out. And one of the disciples looks and says, look at this grand and glorious thing that Herod has built for us. Huge stones, gold, all kinds of things around. Here it is, this magnificent edifice as a tribute to our people. Look at how big these stones are. You know, the bigger things are, the more permanent they are. And Jesus looks over and he says, that's not going to last. That is not going to last. You and I, we seek big things in our lives, don't we? We look at those kind of buildings. We look at big, strong, steel buildings, concrete, all sorts of things, and we look at them as if they're going to last because they're big. They're the big stones in our lives. Or maybe there are other things that are big things for us. Maybe it has to do with something that's special in our lives, or a relationship, or a person. You know how as we get older, the big people in our lives, the really big people, the older we get, the smaller they seem. We tend to latch on to things, big things in our lives. And Jesus proclaims to us, it doesn't matter how big those things are, they're not going to endure. They are not going to endure. This week I watched the final episode of MASH again. Yeah. You remember all the hoopla around it, don't you? You remember how that was all anyone could talk about before it was going to show? You remember how millions of people, they said something like half the population watched that show that night. It was one of those things, one of those shows that went on forever. It ran for 10 years. And even though in the back of our minds we knew that it was going to end at some point, it never seemed to get there. It kept coming back. It kept showing up. So here was this big event where we were going to watch the end of this. And as I watched it the other night, two things really struck me. The first was that it still packed that emotional punch. It moved me like I was watching it for the first time. But the other thing that struck me was that as it got toward the end of the show, something really interesting happened. You see, I could tell you where every tent was on that set. And I could tell you whose was there and who used to live there and who lived there now, because there was something very permanent about it. But as we got to the end, I was shocked at how quickly those tents came down. And they were packed on the trucks. And people climbed in jeeps and trucks and helicopters and went away. And it happened in a flash. Until the last thing you see is Hawkeye looking out of the helicopter down at that final word, goodbye. And it was gone. Our invitation from Jesus is to hold on to that which endures. To open our hearts not just to those things that are big, that we make big in our lives in order to somehow satisfy something about ourselves, but to open our hearts to the only one who can complete them. To open ourselves to that which endures. It's easy to get caught up in the big things. It's easy to get caught up in Berlin. It's easy to get caught up in Paris. It's easy to get caught up in big things like that in our lives. But as followers of Jesus, we are called to hold on to that which endures. And it is in that thing, in that kingdom of God thing, in that love thing, where we find the strength and courage to live our lives and the comfort and peace that come only from the presence of God in us. So hold on. When you pass those places where you grew up and they are no more, or when that person you held in such high esteem seems to come down to be a human just like you or me, or when those things that we hold to really don't fulfill us, look to that which endures. God's love in Christ made real to us in the kingdom of God. And there find your strength and courage, your comfort and peace, and your life.